It is my pleasure to introduce the next part of our program this evening, and the first of many important discussions on the legacy of Pope Benedict XVI. We will hear from Professors Marianne Glendon, Jean-Pierre Scoop, and Laurent Trigal. It is my distinct honor to introduce our first speaker, Professor Marianne Glendon. Marianne Glendon is the Learned Hand Professor of Law at Harvard University, Emerita, and a former U.S. Ambassador to the Holy See. She currently serves as a commissioner of the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom and is a member of the Board of Supervisors of the Institute of Religious Works. She writes and teaches in the fields of human rights, comparative law, constitutional law, and political theory. Glendon is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the Pontifical Academy of Social Sciences, serving as president from 2003 to 2013, and the International Academy of Comparative Law. She is also a past president of the UNESCO-sponsored International Association of Legal Science. She served 2 terms as a member of the U.S. President's Council on Bioethics and has represented the Holy See at various conferences, including the 1995 UN Women's Conference in Beijing, where she headed the Vatican delegation. Glendon was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences in 1991, received the National Humanities Medal in 2006, and was the recipient of the Notre Dame Evangelium Vitae Medal in 2018. Professor Marianne Glendon.
Thank you, Justin, for that very kind introduction. I'm so grateful to the organizers of this event and the succeeding events that await us. And I'm especially grateful for having been invited to open our discussion of a speech that, in my opinion, was greatly underappreciated at the time that it was given. I think Pope Benedict himself, at least I think there's good evidence to believe that Pope Benedict himself considered this to be an important speech. When he was on the plane coming over to the United States and having a chat with the journalists, he said that he considered his visit to the United Nations on the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights to be one of the 2 main reasons for his visit. And he said there was a special reason for the visit to the UN in that anniversary year. And that was, he said 15 years ago, that the world was experiencing a crisis in values. Imagine 15 years ago, and how much better are we doing right now? So I'm assuming that whatever he had to say about that crisis in values 15 years ago is still relevant to us, even though it didn't get much attention when he gave the speech. And what he said he hoped to, when he was talking on the plane, what he said he hoped to contribute at the UN was, quote, to confirm and reinforce as much as possible the 1948 consensus that certain values are fundamental and written in the being of the human person. Well, sad to say, that 1948 consensus that he was referring to is now falling apart. No one has described our current situation better in recent days than the distinguished political commentator Walter Russell Mead, who wrote 2 months ago, "The most important fact in world politics today is that the core institutions and initiatives of the so-called rules-based international order, the UN, its associated institutions, the Universal Declaration, that those institutions are growing less and less relevant." And it's for that very reason I'd suggest that Pope Benedict's address merits our close attention. In many ways, that speech was the most substantial of 16 speeches that he gave in that whirlwind visit to the United States in 2008. But it was more formal than the other speeches, And it presented, I think my fellow commentators will probably agree that it presented some very complex ideas in a very condensed fashion. And so the New York Times, for example, devoted only a few lines to the speech, and they described it as densely packed with philosophy and theology, which I fear was not meant to be a compliment. And I think maybe my co-discussants here will agree that it's not densely packed with philosophy and theology. In fact, as has been said already, it was a political speech. And Pope Benedict, to the surprise of many, turned out actually to be very good to giving political speeches. So my hope this afternoon or this evening is, with the help of my colleagues, to encourage more appreciation of this speech. First, by expanding on some of the more condensed passages in it, and by looking at this speech in the context of both what previous popes have said at the UN on anniversaries of the Universal Declaration, and also in the context of the other political speeches that Pope Benedict was giving around that same time. When he started out his speech at the UN, he sounded as though he was going to be very much in the vein of what previous popes had said about the Universal Declaration. The Holy See has consistently been a strong, I would say even the strongest, institutional defender of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And even when the document was still being debated in the UN in the fall of 1948, its promoters were greatly assisted in gaining support for it by the then papal nuncio to Paris, one Angelo Roncalli, later to write about the Universal Declaration in Pacem in Terris as Pope John the 23rd. In the years after that, the papal statements about the Declaration were characterized by much appreciation, often mingled with a few words of caution. In 1979, Pope St. John Paul II called it a real milestone on the path of the moral progress of humanity and the basic inspiration and cornerstone of the United Nations organization. And in the years right after that, that was 1979, in the 1980s, the events of the 1980s seemed to amply vindicate those expressions of praise. The Universal Declaration served as a rallying point and inspiration for the great grassroots movements that put an end to apartheid and helped to topple the seemingly indestructible totalitarian regimes of Eastern Europe. And by the 1990s, it had become the single most important reference point for cross-national discussions of international human rights. But those successes had their costs, and the costs appeared in the 1990s. The more that human rights ideas showed their power, the more many groups and interests attempted to capture that power for their own purposes. So in the 90s, there was a veritable explosion of human rights activity. The established human rights organizations were looking for new causes to promote, and many special interest groups began to try to harness the moral authority of the Universal Declaration to their agenda items. And all too often, that meant promoting ideas that were more popular in Western societies than in other parts of the world. And to make matters worse, promoters of new rights claims often attacked established rights that did not suit their agendas, ignoring the principle that the rights in the Universal Declaration are interdependent, mutually conditioning, indivisible. And those tensions all came to a head in the 1990s, in the 1994 Cairo Population Conference, in the 1995 Beijing Conference, when the Declaration came under direct attack. That's why, I believe, John Paul II took the occasion of his 1998 World Day of Peace message to point out that the Declaration was being, quote, blatantly violated, not only through direct oppression, but in a more subtle way, through an attempt to reinterpret or willfully misinterpret its provisions. So by the time of Pope Benedict's address, 10 years after that, the whole human rights project was in crisis. The Declaration was misunderstood by many, misinterpreted, manipulated by others, and ignored by the world's worst rights violators. Questions that the drafters of the Declaration thought they had handled pretty well in 1948 came back with a vengeance. Questions like, how can any rights be universal in a world of great cultural and political diversity? What happens when one fundamental right clashes with another? What roles should society, the state, international bodies play in enforcing rights? So there was much curiosity about what Pope Benedict would say when he came to the UN in 2008. And very much like his predecessors, he began with praise for the Declaration. He said, it had enabled different cultures, juridical expressions, and institutional models to converge around a fundamental nucleus of values and hence of rights. But that expression of appreciation was immediately followed by the most cautionary, sobering discussion of human rights that has ever been issued from a papal pen before or since. He mentioned no fewer than 10 threats to the Human Rights Project, all of which were becoming more acute. Cultural relativism, I'm going to list them very fast. Cultural relativism, positivism, philosophical relativism, the unsettled question of foundations for human rights, utilitarianism, selective approaches to rights, escalating demands for new rights, hyper-individualistic interpretation of rights, neglect of the relationship between rights and responsibilities, and the threat to religious freedom posed by dogmatic secularism. Now, I think you'll agree that must have been a lot for the audience in the General Assembly to take in. And the fact is that he did not elaborate very much on each one of them. So one of the things that I think might be useful to do here, what I propose to do, is to focus on what he did say about 5 of them, beginning with his warning about how selective approaches to rights have impaired what he called the inner unity of the Declaration. Now, when he spoke of the Declaration's inner unity, as he did a number of times, he was referring to a feature of the Declaration that is widely forgotten today, and if not forgotten, widely ignored. And that is that unlike modern bills of rights, we all have seen bills of rights. In the United States, we have a Bill of Rights. The German Constitution is preceded by a Bill of Rights. Unlike all the bills of rights that we see around us, this document is not just a list. It is much more than a list. It is an integrated document that was constructed as a whole, with all the parts meant to be interdependent, and even with its own built-in hermeneutical instructions. So very different from the average Bill of Rights. As the Vienna Declaration puts it, the principles it contains are universal, indivisible, interdependent, and interrelated. They really didn't need to use all those adjectives. But what they were getting at is when you see a tension, as there will always be a tension, right? There's a tension between freedom and equality. When there's a tension, you may not completely subordinate one to the other. The task for the interpreter is one of harmonization without leaving anything out. But by 2008, the tendency to treat the Declaration as kind of a la carte menu was so prevalent that Pope Benedict must have thought he needed to remind his audience that the document, and here's the quote, cannot be applied piecemeal according to trends or selective choices that run the risk of contradicting the unity of the human person and the indivisibility of human rights. Today, so far as I can see, that warning has still fallen on deaf ears. Now, I'd like to turn to the second of the threats that he emphasized. And this is one that has been with the Universal Declaration from the very beginning, the problem of foundations. He put it this way: the problem of separating human rights from the ethical and rational dimension, which is their foundation and their goal. The preamble of the Universal Declaration says, I'm going to collapse it a little bit, that human dignity is a foundation for human rights. But the problem with that is that the concept of human dignity is highly contested. Dignity has, for many of us, Catholics, we could give that concept a definable content, but the Declaration, the Universal Declaration, as its title suggests, is meant for everybody, people of all or no religions. And so the word dignity in the Declaration seems to have been used just as a placeholder. And we have a good authority on that, Jacques Maritain, who served on a UNESCO commission. The commission was called the Commission to Study the Theoretical Foundations of Human Rights. And at the end of their work, somebody said, well, how did you get agreement on the rights? And Maritain said, we agree on the rights so long as no one asks us why. And that's pretty much where things stand today. And that's why John Paul II felt it important to point out in 1989, quote, the Declaration does not present the anthropological and ethical foundation of the human rights it proclaims. And his advice was, he urged the various schools of thought, and particularly the communities of believers, to provide moral bases for the juridic edifice of human rights. But that task still remains unfinished business, although there are some really marvelous and interesting efforts along those lines. Coming to a third threat that he mentioned, he put it this way, Pope Benedict: the shift from protection of fundamental rights towards the satisfaction of simple interests, often particular interests. I think today we would just say he was talking about the proliferation of rights claims, which is up into the thousands. The framers of the Universal Declaration were not so presumptuous as to think there could never be new rights added to the catalog of fundamental rights. But as a practical matter, they recognized that the number of principles that people of vastly different cultures could agree upon was always going to be rather modest. So they stuck to a few principles that they considered so basic that philosophical or other foundations could be found for them in most of the world's great philosophical systems and religions. I have to say most because obviously nihilism would be a non-starter there. But today, efforts seem to have steadily increased to achieve international recognition as rights for claims that have neither broad consensus around the world nor firm grounding in international law, and that's become a major contributor to the human rights crisis. Fourth threat mentioned by Pope Benedict, also more acute today, the difficult question of where does legitimate pluralism in bringing those fundamental principles to life, where does legitimate pluralism end and cultural relativism begin? If you descend into infinite number of ways of bringing rights to life, then you don't have universality anymore. So that is still, I would say, not so much a puzzle, that's just a challenge, and the kind of challenge that lawyers are used to and that sometimes are pretty good at. Right, yes. So on the one hand, universality of principles does not and cannot mean uniformity in their application, but it's equally clear that the scope for interpretation can't be unlimited. And here's where the Declaration, with its inner unity itself, is helpful, because it does contain these hermeneutical instructions. It even has a mini preamble for the section on social and economic rights, which are explicitly set off from the other rights in the Declaration by a preamble which says, of course, the implementation of these rights depends first on the material resources of each country, and secondly, on the political system. A socialist republic is not going to bring them to life in the same way as a market-oriented country. Now I'm coming to the fifth threat that he mentioned, and that is the threat to religious freedom posed by dogmatic secularism. And here, I would say, is the part of the UN speech where he becomes more expansive, where he starts to talk a little bit more about why and what needs to be done. And I think here, it seems to me maybe that this is the part of the speech where we most clearly hear Pope Benedict's own voice. The topic had already become a major theme of his pontificate, and it ran like a bright thread through all the other speeches that he gave in 2008. For example, in January that year, just before he came to the United States, when I presented my credentials to him, he took the occasion to praise the United States as a nation that values the role of religious belief in ensuring a vibrant and ethically sound democratic order. He expressed admiration for the American plurality of religions. He expressed admiration for the American people's appreciation of the role of religion in public life, and for their recognition, I'm quoting him here, of religion's role in shedding light on the inherent moral dimension of many social issues. And then, April, on the plane coming to the United States, he told the journalists that he was fascinated, that was his word. He said, "I'm fascinated by the fact that the American founders intentionally created a secular state, not out of hostility toward religion, but quite the contrary." He sounded the same theme again at the White House, where he expressed his appreciation for a nation that welcomes the role of religion in the public square, but this time at the White House, he sounded a warning. He was well aware that the form of secularism, the positive form of secularism that he praised, was not in the best of shape in the United States. And so he said at the White House that the question of religious freedom, the erosion of religious freedom, could have damaging effects on America's democratic experiment. And then later that same day, he went and talked to the U.S. bishops, where he said the two most important challenges for the church in America were the advance of relativism and a negative form of secularism characterized by hostility to religion. So all of that was leading up in the next couple of days to the speech in the UN, where now he's addressing a multinational audience. And here he's stressing the need to counter threats to religious freedom on a worldwide basis. Both, and here I'm going to be quoting him, where religion clashes with a prevailing secular ideology, as in many parts of the West, and where it is in conflict with a majority religious position of an exclusive nature, as in many other parts of the world. In the most quoted line of the speech, he said, "It is inconceivable that believers should have to express a part of themselves, their faith, in order to be active citizens. It should never be necessary to deny God in order to enjoy one's rights." But he emphasized that religious freedom ought to be protected not just for the sake of religions and religious believers, but because of the many ways in which religion can contribute to all the good things that the UN Charter says the UN is supposed to be for, all the things, parts of the social order on which social human rights and dignity ultimately depend. Then he took a moment to make clear something about the definition of religious freedom, which all too often, especially these days, gets watered down into freedom of worship. And he makes clear that when he uses the expression, he means the capacious concept in Article 18 of the Declaration. And he adds, "The full guarantee of religious liberty must give due consideration to the public dimension of religion and hence to the possibility of believers playing their part in building the social order." Now, I want to note here that while he was in the US talking about positive and negative secularism, he never once associated negative secularism with any particular country. But a few months later, he took his message about religious freedom to the cradle of anti-religious secularism, and speaking to French politicians, and well aware that the French Constitution specifically provides that France is a secular, a lay republic, he said this: "At this moment in history, I am firmly convinced that a new reflection on the meaning and importance of laïcité is now necessary." And to the surprise of many, then French President Nicolas Sarkozy not only expressed enthusiastic agreement, but also said, "We would be crazy if we denied ourselves the benefits of religion in the polity." Meanwhile, back in Rome, where the newspapers in Rome gave these speeches much better coverage than anywhere else. And so meanwhile, back in Rome, Pope Benedict's remarks on secularism gave rise to a certain amount of puzzlement. At least I can say that at the US Embassy, we received many, many calls saying, well, you're the US Embassy, explain to us, what is this positive secularism, this American model the Pope is always talking about? And some of these callers sounded unhappy to hear that the head of the Roman Catholic Church was promoting a form of secularism, even if he did put the word positive in front of it. Well, the fact is, and I'm sure Ratzinger scholars here know better than I, the fact is that Pope Benedict, his bid to reinterpret the concept of secularism was of long standing. As Joseph Ratzinger, he had already developed a contrast between secularism as a posture of neutrality and secularism as a posture of opposition to religion. And interestingly, I think, his discussions of positive and negative secularism bear a remarkable similarity to what Alexis de Tocqueville had written after his voyage to America nearly 2 centuries earlier. Tocqueville says in the Democracy in America, he wants to address the religion question to two sorts of audiences who were very skeptical about religious freedom. So to religious people, devout people like his mother, he says, actually, the American example shows that religion flourishes in an atmosphere of religious freedom. And to religious skeptics, Enlightenment skeptics, like most of his friends, he argued that religion would actually buttress and help to support the cultural conditions that the emerging free societies and young democracies would require. Okay, now coming back to that speech in the United Nations, when he was winding up the speech, he said a few words, and the assembled diplomats, the place was full. It was standing room only, and the diplomats rose and gave him a prolonged standing ovation. And I was, as a member of the audience, I was looking around, and of course I was very pleased that he was getting this prolonged standing ovation, but I couldn't help wondering what it was that these diplomats thought that they were applauding, what was going through their minds. But, after having thought about it for a long time, what I'm inclined to think is the applause that he got, and it was thunderous, I think it was mainly for Pope Benedict as a moral witness, as a global moral witness. And I think also, having run into a number of diplomats, I think also it was in gratitude for hearing a few words of truth being spoken by someone who wasn't there just as a representative of the sovereign entity that was his own, but who was speaking for all of humanity. And I think they saw something in their Pope's person and in his words that they wished they could emulate, even though their roles didn't always give them the opportunity to do so. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Glendon, for your wonderful insights this evening. Next, we will hear from Father Jean-Pierre Scoop. Father Scoop serves as professor of canon law at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross here in Rome. Born in Brussels, he received his doctorate in law from the University of Paris, Panthéon-Assas, and a doctorate in canon law from the University of Navarra in Spain. He teaches on the relationship between church and the political community, as well as courses on human rights. He's worked on ecclesiastical tribunals in Belgium, and since 2011 has also been consultor for the Dicastery for Legislative Text.
Thank you. Dear academic authorities, colleagues, students, and friends, I would like to thank the Ratzinger Foundation and the other organizers for inviting me to this session on Benedict XVI's legacy. I take the floor after the commentary by Professor Glendon, whom I have already had the pleasure of meeting in Rome. And I fully share her analysis of Benedict XVI's speech to the UN. As a discussant of this speech, my approach will be in the fight of philosophy of law and even political philosophy. I would like to return to one of the key points addressed in her speech, namely the problem of the foundation of human rights. I'll then turn to a second aspect in relation to pluralism. This concerns the importance of public debate and the practice of dialogue in accordance with the ethics of discussion, to which Benedict alluded in his speech to the UN, and which presupposes specific preparation on the part of the faithful, I think. This conjunction of these two aspects, the foundation of human rights in human nature and pluralistic dialogue, will enable us to better measure the importance of the work of Ratzinger Benedict. First part, the problem of the foundation of human rights. In his address to the UN, Benedict considers human rights as a common language and the ethical substratum of international relations, and affirms that the rights proclaimed in the Declaration are based on the natural inscribed on human hearts and present in different cultures and civilizations. They are therefore part of a universal context, even if the historical expression of human rights arose in the West. They are indeed the rights of all human beings, all human beings. The drafters of the Declaration, who belong to different religions and philosophical convictions, reached the long-awaited consensus after deep reflection and external consultation. If this agreement is the outcome of a convergence of different religious and cultural traditions, all of them motivated by the common desire to place the human person at the heart of institutions and laws, the basis of the rights, the rights recognized remained deliberately veiled. It was the price to be paid. The method proposed by Jacques Maritain, a neo-Thomist philosopher, certainly non-suspected of relativism, of positivism, involved not asking why. I'll remind by Professor Glendon. This method has both an advantage and a disadvantage. The great advantage was that the Declaration was actually achieved at a time of great urgencies after the end of the Second World War. As for the disadvantage, it is becoming clearer by the day. Human dignity remains an undefined concept. There was then a common idea of man, at least intuitive and approximative, which made it possible to agree on the main rights. But as Glendon rightly remarks, the framers of the Declaration recognized that the number of principles that people of vastly different cultures can or will recognize as universal is relatively modest. I agree with that. It's important. However, it was not long before the harmony concerning the idea of man and his fundamental rights lost its consistency. Thus, by the end of the 20th century, a fortiori in 2008, the agreement had already been largely undermined. On the other hand, the claim for new rights had ceased to be modest and continued to grow. A typical example of the new attitude we are beginning to observe in the European Union Charter of Fundamental Rights, 2000, which not only adds certain rights whose legitimacy is open to critique, but also excludes Europe's Christian roots from its protocol, with a lot of consequences in the interpretation and so forth. However, it doesn't prevent human dignity from being recognized as the foundation of human rights in the preamble to the Declaration and in other legal texts that address the question of their foundation. If the human rights system is currently undermined and even threatened with implosion, it is due to a lack of clarity regarding the concept of human dignity itself. The situation is akin to a skyscraper with a hidden flaw in its foundations. The entire stability of the edifice is affected. In this way, the human rights system suffers from a neutralization of human dignity, even though this notion should be the raison d'être of each of the rights protected. So what can we do? What can we do? It's a big problem. While some philosophers and jurists cross swords over the concept of dignity, Benedict recalls the common origin of the person in God's creative design. This, he believes, is the only way to preserve the universal character of human rights, their indivisibility, and thus avoid succumbing to ethical relativism. On the other hand, the current vague and imprecise concept of human dignity is undoubtedly not to the displeasure of a relativist currents of thought, which are happy to accept the notion of a foundation deprived of any operative character. Benedict XVI, not being a jurist, hardly dwells on this theme. He keeps to a sapiential level and urges the necessary discernment. One of his main qualities is that he is always careful not to overstep the boundaries of his own theological and/or magisterial domain. From this point of view, his writings provide important and always valid answers to those questions, which in his discourses are only presented in summary form. We will also recall the work carried out with his encouragement by the International Theological Commission on Universal Ethics. Having said this, objectively calls for the acknowledgement that our author also experienced a certain disappointment with the effectiveness of the traditional Catholic conception of natural law in secularized states. As far back as 1987, in a publication on ecclesiology, he didn't hesitate to describe it as hypertrophied, in French, émoussé. This bitter conclusion is hardly surprising where Christian faith and culture are lost. So, too, is the evidence of human beings, creaturely conditioned, and the perception of their dependence on the Creator through natural law. Since Professor Glendon has been careful not to open the Pandora's box of the question of foundation of human rights, Allow me to venture into this area and summarize the fruits of my personal research. A clarification of the concept of human dignity could prevent the foundation of human rights from being relegated to a purely symbolic, even decorative role, and encourage a revival of the human rights system. But how does one define human dignity? That's the question. In my opinion, it would require abandoning the concept of absolute autonomy of the Kantian type in favor of a relative autonomy based on a Christian anthropology or an ontology of the person as participation of God's being. But it won't be easy to reach an agreement because it will restate in an heightened state the very problem that Maritain and his team agreed to circumvent. Every effort should be made to ensure agreement is reached on a satisfactory concept of human dignity, not least by relying on the momentum generated by the current crisis in the system of human rights. The concept of human dignity could then aspire to fulfill the effective role that a foundation should have. Human dignity, duly clarified, could then fulfill a multiple function in the system of human rights. In the light of the human dignity, it would be necessary to promote human rights, select them, strengthen their protection, control their orientation and legitimate exercise, and finally, ensure their correct interpretation. It is scarcely possible to develop this idea in this brief presentation, but I hope to be able to publish a book on this subject in the near future. And I pass to the second part. Preparing the faithful for dialogue in public debates. Realistically, Benedict realizes that Christian morality can't remain in a bubble, or more academic, isolated, and that in order to transmit it, it must be transmitted through the political ethics of public debate. With pluralism, the aim is no longer to impose Christian values on others, but rather to share them with others in an open and respectful dialogue. Without denying his doctrinal position, the Pope is not only interested in theories, but also personally puts into practice these virtues of dialogue. As we know, he enters into dialogue with several high-level intellectuals, including the philosopher Jürgen Habermas. In his speech to the UN, he presents dialogue as the means by which the various components of society can articulate their point of view and build consensus around the truth concerning particular values or goals. From the outset, we see a reference to truth. For him, consensus must be oriented towards truth, which distinguishes his position from the search for formal agreement in compliance with procedural rules, but without verification of the veracity of the process and the dimensions of substantial justice. Also, he does not refer here to John Rawls. His conception of consensus is distinctly different from an overlapping consensus. Indeed, this type of overlapping agreement is not immune to the direct search for the necessary votes by agreeing on a common denominator that is sometimes minimalist or guided by simple partisan instructions. In such cases, the agreement may not be the fruit of a genuine in-depth debate on ethical values. It may also be that not all players were able to assert their specificity within the political assembly. While such an agreement reached by simple cross-checking may speed up decision-making, it runs the risk of lapsing into demagogy and dangerous affecting the quality of democratic debate. Before pointing out other limits imposed by politic ethics, we must begin by mentioning a limit concerning the majority principle underlined by Benedict in the Reichstag speech. For most of the matters that need to be regulated by law, the support of the majority can serve as a sufficient criterion. Yet it is evident that for the fundamental issues of law, in which the dignity of men and of humanity is at stake, the majority principle is not enough. Everyone in a position of responsibility must personally seek out the criteria to be followed when framing laws. End of the citation. This important ethical and legal observation corresponds to a key distinction in constitutional law. In view of the hierarchy of norms, the essential values and fundamental rights of a state must be distinguished from ordinary legislation and are subject to special protection. Whereas ordinary laws must always comply with the constitution or basic law, the essential values of the rule of law and fundamental rights are of a higher rank and enjoy the specific protection of a constitutional court. While reiterating the validity of the autonomy of both churches and states, each in its own sphere, Benedict XVI maintains that pluralism in no way implies that religion should be banished from public life. Democracy needs to the specific contribution that religions are called upon to make to public debate. But the contribution of religious groups can't, in principle, be made on the basis of arguments of authority, because in a pluralist context, each religion, even when it intends to express universal natural law, like the Catholicism, only expresses a comprehensive doctrine, that is, a particular doctrine in a pluralist context. Therefore, contributions from religion should be translated into rational terms and rational arguments. Throughout his work, Benedict readily shows how Christianity, unlike other religions, has not subordinately clung the revelation alone, but he has resolutely chosen the camp of reason. This rational argumentation can take the form of philosophical reasoning, not theological, but philosophical reasoning, or any other form of rational knowledge. In this way, it will be possible to demonstrate the legitimacy of the institution of the traditional family, for instance, by comparing the advantages that the model of living together can offer in comparison with other alternative models in terms of health, well-being, psychological maturity for both parents and children, or socio-economic or political consequences, etc. These different aspects can be objectively drawn from statistical data. In this way, reasons from religion or natural law are admissible as ordinary rational arguments. Benedict is also aware of other limits to dialogue, which directly concern him in his role as both a theologian and the Roman Pontiff, guarantor of the deposit of Catholic doctrine. As we know, the magisterial function is the only type of faculty, a term preferred to that of power, that the Catholic Church intends to retain in matters of temporal affairs. This pastoral role, consisting in the formation of consciences, includes the illumination of a moral judgment of its own. Inherent to the Church mission, it can't be renounced, while it is not the Church's role to provide ready-made technical solutions that may encroach on the autonomy of political powers. The common pastor has the right and duty to make concrete ethical judgments. For example, in his address to the diplomatic corps, Benedict was quick to criticize a ruling by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights on in vitro fertilization. He criticizes the judges for arbitrarily redefining the moment of conception and weakening the protection of the unborn. In this way, the Pope intervenes pastorally in ethical matters in accordance with his magisterial function, which is not restricted to the Catholic alone. Admittedly, the position of a Roman pontiff will be more binding than that of a theologian, and the ordinary faithful have greater autonomy than clerics in political action. Yet, it is the laity who are called upon to be the main protagonists of the Christian message in political forums and public debates. However, if they want to be consistent, they will seek ethical inspiration from the ecclesiastical magisterium. I conclude. Benedict XVI's legacy is not only to be found in the theological and philosophical tradition of which he is a brilliant witness. His legacy also includes a totally innovative aspect, especially for a pope, taking seriously the ethics of discussion in political debates. The challenge for Christians is to be faithful interpreters and convincing translators of this axiological wisdom, particularly in public debates. The main challenge will be to arrive at a common definition of human dignity that is not emptied of its specific context. Of course, such ambitious goals are necessarily long-term, but time is running out, also for me. From this point of view, it would be desirable for the Church, within the framework of its modus docendi, to take greater responsibility for the specific preparation of the lay faithful for this priority task. In conclusion, Benedict can be characterized by the term pontifex. He is the one who builds bridges between the tradition of the Logos, to use a term dear to him, and the innovation represented by the political ethics inherent in a plural society. Thank you for your attention and patience.
Thank you, Father Scoop. Now we will hear from Professor Laurent Trigal. Professor Trigal is an associate professor of the University of Paris Panthéon-Assas and deputy director of the Center for Analysis and Research in International Relations. His research topics include theory of international public law and international law of armed conflicts.
Thank you. Reverend Father, I would like to first express my gratitude to the Ratzinger Foundation, to the Pontifical Gregorian University, and to the University of Notre Dame for this invitation. It's really an immense honor and privilege to stand here in the Eternal City and to articulate through this UN address the perspective of Pope Benedict XVI on international relations within the framework of the United Nations. As Professor Glendon points out, Pope refers, I'm tempted to say surprisingly, at the beginning of his address, to the concept of the responsibility to protect. Surprisingly, because this concept, a very technical one, seems to pertain to the narrow sphere of specialists, lawyers, or diplomats. Is it a mere evocation of a trendy concept suggested by the Pope advisor to satisfy the diplomatic exercise? Probably not, since the reference fits perfectly with the letter and the spirit of the address, and more generally, with the spirituality of Pope Benedict XVI. I would like to make a few comments on this subject during my speaking time. As Paul VI and John Paul II did in the past, this address is pronounced before the General Assembly, the most representative and universal organ of the United Nations. Pope Benedict XVI thus continues and maintains what appears to be nowadays a tradition by which popes are led to describe in a Christian perspective, in a Catholic perspective, the merits of interstate cooperation and the very function of the UN organization. Of course, in terms of substance, Benedict XVI stresses that the United Nations is devoted to the promotion of human rights and fundamental freedom of the person, including religious freedom. As set out in the UN Charter, the purpose of the organization is, among others, to, I quote, achieve international cooperation in encouraging respect for human rights and for fundamental freedom for all. In this regard, the speech aligns entirely with the principle of the United Nations Charter, albeit from a legal perspective. Indeed, throughout the Cold War, the primary focus was quite exclusively on peace and security, often at the expense of human rights and development issues. As stated by the International Court of Justice in 1962, the preservation of international peace and security stood as the foremost objective of the United Nations, particularly the Security Council, which is entrusted with the primary responsibility for the maintenance of peace and security. However, there was a reluctance among the Security Council to categorize massive human rights violations or serious breaches of international humanitarian law as threat of breach of the peace and security. The concept of international peace and security was traditionally interpreted in connection with armed conflict, with military confrontation involving two or more belligerent states. This interpretation is the reason why the Security Council faced significant challenges in addressing massive human rights violations perpetrated by a state against its own population. Efforts to broaden the scope of the notion of threat to peace and security to include human rights violation faced strong opposition from a majority of Security Council members. They were vigilant that violation of human rights, serious or not, remain within the exclusive jurisdiction of the states. Presently, some member states remain opposed to any Security Council intervention in the situation in Syria or Myanmar, the Rohingya case. They argue that this situation is strictly an internal and political matter, incapable of being classified as a threat or international or even regional peace and security. This stance clarify why historically certain states yielded to the temptation of resorting to unilateral force. In the early 90s, there was a widespread belief that, with the disappearance of the Cold War, international relations would be grounded in peace, multilateralism, and cooperation. In addressing crises such as those in the Balkans or Rwanda, the Security Council initially exhibited genuine and sincere unity. However, just a few years later, the first sign of discord emerged, particularly in 1999, when NATO launches extensive air attacks against military and civilian facilities in Serbia. The justification was the alleged unacceptable abuses committed by the Serbian armed forces against Albanian-speaking population in Kosovo, all under the powerless gaze of the Security Council. Notably, no resolution was in sight due to some members' opposition poised to veto any proposed resolution. But in the NATO rationale, the only available course was therefore unilateral intervention, without any legal or political support from the Security Council. The posture was more ethic than legal. In this context of resurgence of Cold War practices, the United Nations initiated in 2001 a reflection on the legality of the unilateral use of force to protect civilian population from action by their own state. The United Nations tried to reach a compromise between two concerns seemingly in contradiction: the respect of the state's sovereignty, a core element of the interstate life, and the respect of the physical and moral integrity of the person, a core element of the moral life. The responsibility to protect concept referenced by Pope Benedict XVI, is an outcome of this evolution, officially embraced by the General Assembly in 2005 and by the Security Council in 2006. According to this concept, states bear the primary responsibility for safeguarding their own population, and in this respect, the international community stands apart. The coercive action of the Security Council is only envisaged in a subsidiary manner when the state is precisely unable or unwilling to fulfill its duties. No entity in the international community has the authority to substitute for the Council, which remains the foremost international body tasked with the maintenance of global peace and security. Yet, in order to grasp the full scope of Benedict XVI speech, I need to underscore a crucial aspect. Benedict XVI goes beyond simply identifying the founding principle of the United Nations. In invoking the responsibility to protect, Benedict XVI not only recognized the significance and value of the concept for the United Nations, but also affirmed the legitimacy of the UN as a system, as an organization. He understands that this concept enhances the UN authority in addressing the most delicate matter in international relations. In this concept, the speech integrates both the essence, the protection of human rights, and the institutional framework, the Security Council role. International relations are shaped not only by law and principle, but also by form and structure established through the will of the states themselves. As per Benedict XVI, I quote, "In the context of international relations, it is necessary, not suitable, necessary. It is necessary to recognize the higher role played by rules and structure that are intrinsically ordered to promote the common good and therefore to safeguard human freedom." Additionally, he notes, I quote again, "The organization will increasingly serve as a sign of unity between states and an instrument of service to the entire human family." It was undoubtedly necessary that Pope Benedict XVI recalls this framework. Temptation to resort to unilateral force remains pregnant. Some states are still willing to intervene without even referring to the UN Security Council every time human rights or international humanitarian law are violated. However, and it is my second pivotal point, the rationale of Pope Benedict XVI extends beyond this. At first glance, the reasoning based on the concept of responsibility to protect is very critical about state sovereignty. But in the UN language, United Nations language, the responsibility to protect relies on a new conception of state sovereignty, far away from any absolutist or arbitrary interpretation, where sovereignty is synonymous with complete freedom and therefore impunity. On the contrary, with the responsibility to protect, sovereignty is synonymous with responsibility and therefore accountability. State cannot hide behind its sovereignty to escape the international debate. It cannot do so, all the less because as sovereign entity, it enjoys all its sovereign privileges and means to fulfill its obligation vis-à-vis its own population. No excuse could be accepted when the state has all its sovereign power to protect its population. If it is unable to do so, it is clearly always able to ask the international community for help and assistance. Under the responsibility to protect concept, sovereignty and the interest of the international community are not autonomous. Instead, sovereignty and they align toward a shared objective, the common good, quoted by the Pope Benedict XVI. In a sense, the responsibility to protect also rehabilitates the sovereignty with a new interpretation. And in this regard, Benedict XVI does not echo a legal doctrine entirely unrelated to the message of the Church. He follows a lengthy theological tradition, wherein each entity or individual acts with freedom. This freedom is not isolated, but rather interconnected with others. Even international relations are part of God's plan and unfold in the presence of God. Pope Benedict certainly remembers the teaching of Francisco de Vitoria and the School of Salamanca, where natural law, not created by people or nation, but given by God, even governs international relations. Here, like any individual, the state is obligated by both rights and duties. Here, like any individual, the state has to seek the common good. Even the United Nations is bound by this principle. As we can see, Pope Benedict XVI developed here a profound reflection on the organic structuring of the international relation. It is not a passing thought, but a true reflection which Benedict XVI developed in other places. Already in the New Year Mass of 2006, 2 years before this UN address, Pope Benedict stresses the United Nations must, I quote, take a renewed awareness of its responsibilities for the promotion of the value of justice, solidarity, and peace in a world increasingly marked by the vast phenomenon of globalization. More significantly, in the encyclical Caritas in Veritate, published in 2009, just a year after the UN speech, he evokes again the fundamental role of the United Nations to preserve the international peace and justice in the context of the economic crisis of subprime. Pope Benedict XVI thus consolidates a true and genuine doctrine on international relations. It is a matter of politics, of course, but guided and enlightened by a spiritual and theological dimension. And here, as elsewhere, Benedict XVI shows a very subtle, a very delicate perception of the societal issue, even in international relations. Thank you for your attention.
I'd like to invite Father Lombardi for a closing remark.
Sì, traduco.
Io non avevo previsto delle parole di conclusione di
So I've not
questo
foreseen concluding
incontro,
words.
però mi sembra che siano opportune.
I think it's opportune.
Come abbiamo ben capito, questo è il primo stadio di un lungo progetto.
So as we've understood, this is the first stage of a very long project.
Come ci hanno spiegato i due organizzatori del progetto,
So as the two organizers of the
c'è
project have
tutta
explained,
una serie di temi dei grandi discorsi del Papa Benedetto che dovranno essere approfonditi.
so it's a whole series of talks looking at these great themes of Pope Benedict that need to be further delved into.
Questo è il primo,
This is the first.
e quindi questo è un antipasto del progetto che si svilupperà anche nei prossimi mesi.
So this is the antipasto, the hors d'oeuvre of what's going to be developed in the coming months.
C'è scritto unfinished debates.
So it's written here, unfinished debates.
Non ci dobbiamo illudere che noi finiamo una discussione e un approfondimento di un tema.
So we shouldn't really delude ourselves and think that we're going to finish, developing a theme right now.
Noi crediamo che la legacy di Benedetto è di continuare a approfondire, a pensare, a cercare le soluzioni dei problemi che cambiano.
So that the whole legacy of Benedict is to delve into, to progress, to look at various solutions for problems that are continually changing. This is his heritage.
Una cosa che io ho imparato da Benedetto
One of the things that I learned from Benedict
e che lui ha affidato alla fondazione
And
nel
which he
primo
entrusted to
discorso
the-
che mi ha fatto,
he entrusted to the foundation in his first discourse to the foundation.
è che noi non dobbiamo pensare che lui abbia risolto tutti i problemi del mondo
We shouldn't think that he's resolved all the problems of the world
e della Chiesa,
and of the church,
ma che lui ci ha insegnato
but he's
una
taught us
via,
a way,
un metodo,
a method,
un atteggiamento,
An attitude,
un rigore
a vigor
con cui
with which
affrontare i problemi
we can confront
della
the problems
Chiesa
in the church
e del mondo
and in the world
di cui stiamo parlando
of
questa
which we
sera.
are speaking this evening.
Quindi
Therefore,
noi abbiamo fatto un esercizio insieme,
this has been a
grazie
common
ai
exercise.
nostri oratori,
Thanks to our collaborators,
su che cosa è questa legacy come vivente.
what is this living heritage?
Noi non dobbiamo domandarci tanto che cosa avrebbe fatto oggi Benedetto
So we really shouldn't be asking
in
someone what Benedict
situazioni
have done
nuove
in new
che lui
situations
non vive
which he
su
didn't
questa
live
terra.
in this earth.
Non dobbiamo aspettarci da lui le decisioni di oggi e le soluzioni dei problemi di oggi, ma dobbiamo imparare da lui come nella nostra responsabilità
Okay.
e nella nostra approfondimento
So we can't really expect from him all of the answers to the present problems or solutions, but really rather a method that's going to help us to confront these.
e quindi io ringrazio moltissimo di avere avviato il
So I'm
progetto.
very thankful and that we've been able to launch the project.
Abbiamo visto a quale livello di profondità possono essere trattati i diversi
So we've
argomenti
seen at the great depth with which these various themes can be treated.
e ne siamo molto grati agli oratori e agli organizzatori.
So we're very grateful to the organizers of the conference.
E continuiamo anche domani
We will
e
continue tomorrow,
sempre
always,
a riflettere
reflecting
qual è
what
l'eredità di
the heritage
Benedetto,
of Benedict,
come ci ha insegnato
how he has taught
a
us
vivere
to live
e affrontare
and to
i
confront
problemi.
the problems.
Grazie.
Thank you.